Most people remember her as the smiling grandmother of a nation. The soft pastel coats, the powder blue hats, the little gloved wave that seemed to promise everyone watching that the world was still gentle and still kind. For 70 years, she was the most loved woman in Britain. But the people who worked for her, and the family who lived beside her, knew a second woman behind the first. A woman who never forgot a slight. A woman who could smile at a funeral and mean none of it. A woman who chose two enemies in her long life and made certain that both of them died on the outside, frozen out of the family she guarded. This is the story of the face and of the steel behind it. If you love the stories the official histories smooth over, the ones told from inside the palace rather than outside the gates, subscribe now and stay with me. What follows is not the grandmother you were sold. Chapter 1. The Castle That Buried Its Own. She was born into a family that had spent 300 years learning how to lock its secrets behind a wall and smile at the door. The date was the 4th of August, 1900. Queen Victoria still sat on the throne in the last full summer of her long reign. The child was Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon. She was the youngest daughter and the 9th of 10 children of Claude Bowes-Lyon, the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. Her mother was Cecilia Cavendish Bentinck, Countess of Strathmore. On paper, the family was very grand. In truth, it stood at a comfortable distance from the crown. They were old Scottish aristocracy, not royalty. Their titles reached back further than most of the crowned houses of Europe. Their land was wide and their blood was ancient. But they were subjects, not sovereigns. And that gap between the family and the throne would shape everything the youngest girl became. She did not marry into the monarchy as an equal. She came to it from the outside. And once inside, she would guard it with the watchful zeal of a convert. She was a 9th child, near the end of a long line, with little reason to expect that history would ever notice her. Much of her early childhood was spent not in Scotland at all, but at St. Paul's Walden Bury, the family's house in Hertfordshire. That was a warm and ordinary English home, all gardens and ponies and a favourite younger brother. Yet the name that clung to her, the name that carried the weight of 3 centuries, belonged to a place much colder and much older. The ancestral seat of the Strathmores was Glamis Castle, in Angus, in the east of Scotland. Glamis was not a comfortable house. It was one of the oldest inhabited castles in the whole country, a tall tower house built on an L plan, raised in pink sandstone, and extended by hungry generations into a forest of turrets and shuttered rooms and twisting stairs. Shakespeare had reached for it when he needed a place dark enough for murder. It was Glamis that he gave to Macbeth. To be raised a Bowes-Lyon was to grow up in the long shadow of that name, in a house that Scotland called one of its most haunted, a place that seemed to hold its own weather in the stone. And Glamis kept a secret, or the world was quite certain that it did. For generations, the Strathmore family was said to guard something monstrous behind its walls. The story ran like this. Somewhere in the castle, in a room with no window that opened and a door that was never shown, there lived a hidden heir. He had been born so grotesquely deformed that the family could not bear to let the world see him. So they told the world that he had died as an infant, and then they kept him alive in secret, walled away year after year, decade after decade, while the line of succession passed him by as though he had never drawn breath. The legend had a cruel refinement. The secret, it was said, was told to each true heir on his 21st birthday. He was taken aside and shown the thing the family hid, and from that day he carried the knowing of it for the rest of his life. Those who believed the tale claimed it could be read in the men of the house. A shadow fell across the sons of Glamis once they came of age. A weight settled behind the eyes and never lifted again. Now, this is legend, and it must be named as legend. No deformed heir was ever produced. No walled room was ever proven to hold a living soul. One much-quoted verdict on the whole affair cut straight to the bone, that the real secret of Glamis is that there is no secret at all. Perhaps that is the plain truth of it. Perhaps the monster was only a story the great house told about itself, the way old families sometimes do, to make their silences feel grand instead of merely cold. The verdict has never been settled, and it does not need to be, because the meaning of the monster of Glamis does not depend on whether he ever breathed. The meaning is in the machine that the story describes. Here was a family that the whole country believed capable of burying a person alive behind its walls and smiling at the gate. Here was a household imagined to have an inside and an outside, a truth for the family and a story for the world, held apart across the span of lifetimes. A servant at Glamis is said to have warned that anyone who knew the true secret of the castle would never again be happy. Monster or no monster, the household knew the shape of concealment by heart. Elizabeth was raised inside that shape. Consider what such a world teaches a watchful child. It teaches that a family is a fortress, and that a fortress has walls for a reason. It teaches that what the world is told and what the household knows are two separate accounts, and that the distance between them is not quite a lie. It is a duty. It teaches, above all, that whatever waits in the locked room, the family smiles at the door. Nobody sat the youngest daughter down and taught her these things as lessons. She breathed them in. They were in the stone of the place, in the way the family spoke and the way it fell silent. The girl who absorbed all of this would one day become the most loved woman in Britain. The soft grandmother in the powder blue coats, the gentle gloved wave that seemed to promise a watching nation that the world was still kind. That woman was already forming inside the girl at Glamis, though no one could have seen it yet. The nation would come to see the smile. The family would always see what was behind it. And no household on earth was better prepared to keep those two things apart than the one that had raised her to do exactly that. For all its grandeur, there was warmth in her childhood too, and it matters to the truth of her. She was funny, quick, and easy with people from the start. A small girl who could charm a room without seeming to try. That gift was real. It was never only a mask, but it grew up alongside the other lesson, the older one carved into the family itself, that a Bowes-Lyon does not show the world the thing the world is not meant to see. Charm on the surface, control underneath. In her, from very early, the two learned to live together, and neither ever fully let the other go. The people who would one day fear her, and the people who would one day adore her, were both, in a sense, meeting the same girl from Glamis. They simply stood on different sides of the wall. Nothing about her birth marked her out for a throne. A ninth child, in a family with no claim on the crown, had every reason to expect an ordinary aristocratic life and nothing stranger. Seasons in London, a good marriage in time, a house of her own with children running through it, the steel that later biographers would describe, the long memory, the grudges nursed for decades, the ability to turn in an instant to ice. None of that was written on the christening of a summer baby in the year 1900. It would be forged, piece by piece, by the things that were about to happen to her. And the first of those things was already on its way. She would live to be 101 years old. She would stretch across the whole distance from the reign of Queen Victoria to the age of television and the tabloid. one human thread running through a century that unmade most of the royal houses of Europe. But she was a child of the old world first, a girl running in the ordered gardens of Hertfordshire, a small figure in the cold corridors of Glamis, learning without being told how a family keeps its own counsel. Then the century turned, and the settled world she had been born into began to come apart. She turned 14 in the high summer of 1914, and on the very day of that birthday, the 4th of August, the drums of the largest war the world had yet seen began to sound across Europe. It would swallow the young men of England and Scotland whole. It would reach the muddy fields of France, and it would not stop there. In time it would climb the long drive and come even to Glamis itself, and the great grey house that had learned across 300 years to hide its secrets behind a smile would throw open its doors and fill its ancient halls with the wounded and the dying. Chapter 2. The Girl Who Learned to Hide Grief. She turned 14 on the day her country went to war, and by the next winter the wounded were sleeping in her family's great hall. The date was the 4th of August, 1914. It was her birthday. It was also the day Britain entered the First World War. At Glamis Castle, there should have been a party. There were meant to be fireworks and games on the lawn, and the small triumphs of a girl turning into a young woman. Instead, the telegrams came, and the men of the estate began to pack for the army. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon spent her 14th birthday watching one world close and another open. She was the youngest daughter of the Earl of Strathmore. Her childhood had been divided between the soft fields of St. Paul's Walden Bury in Hertfordshire and the pink sandstone towers of Glamis in Angus. It had been a sheltered world of nurseries and ponies and long Scottish summers. The war reached into that world and changed it within months. Glamis was one of the oldest inhabited castles in the country. It was tall and turreted, dark with age, the place Shakespeare had chosen for the murders in Macbeth. For centuries, it had been a house of privilege and quiet ceremony. Now the army needed beds, and the great houses of Britain were asked to give them. The Strathmores gave Glamis. The grand dining room, where the family had feasted for generations, was cleared and filled with iron cots. Soldiers came north from the trenches to heal there, or to try to. The castle became a convalescent hospital, and it stayed one for the length of the war. Elizabeth was too young to train as a nurse. She was 14, then 15, a girl among broken men. But there was always work for willing hands. She ran errands and carried messages. She kept the soldiers company through the long, grey afternoons. She helped them write letters home to wives and mothers. She sat with the ones who could not sleep. And she talked, and she made them laugh. Her task, without anyone ever quite naming it, was to keep the spirits of the ward up. The work did not let up. The war did not last a season, as some had promised in that first August. It lasted more than 4 years. Over those years, a steady stream of men passed through Glamis, arriving broken and leaving mended, or leaving still broken in ways no castle could fix. Some came with shattered limbs. Some came with the deeper wounds that had no name yet, the shaking and the silence of men whose minds the trenches had ruined. Elizabeth saw all of it. She was a girl of the manner learning, at close range, exactly what the century was going to cost. And she was good at the work. That is the thing to understand about these years. She discovered, very young, that a smile could do real work in a room full of pain. A cheerful face steadied the men. It made the hours pass. It let a soldier who had seen unspeakable things feel, for an afternoon, that the ordinary world was still turning. The wounded adored her. She learned that her own feelings mattered less, in that room, than the comfort she could give. That lesson would define the rest of her life. She was learning to perform warmth on demand. She was learning to put a calm and pleasant surface over whatever moved underneath. At 14, it looked like kindness, and it was kindness. But it was also a discipline, a thing she practiced until it became second nature. The pastel coats and the gentle gloved wave were still decades away. The face that would one day wear them was being shaped now in a castle full of dying men. Then the war took something of her own. She had brothers. Fergus Bowes-Lyon was one of them, older than her, one of the brothers she loved most. Like thousands of young men of his class, he went to fight without hesitation. In 1915, he was killed at the Battle of Loos, one of the bloodiest actions of that terrible year, in which the British army suffered enormous losses for almost no ground. Fergus did not come home. For the family, the blow was immense. He had been young and strong and full of life, and now he was gone, somewhere in the mud of northern France. The grief that fell on Glamis was the same grief falling on tens of thousands of British households that autumn. It did not spare the great families. A castle and a title were no shield against a telegram. And here is the crucible of the chapter. Elizabeth was 15 years old, and she was mourning her adored brother. Yet the wounded were still in the great hall below. They still needed cheering. They still needed the bright, steady girl who came to sit with them and tell them everything would be well. She could not carry her grief into that room, to weep in front of men who had lost far more than she would have been, in the code she had been raised inside, a kind of failure. So she did the thing that would become the signature of her whole long life. She folded the grief away. She kept it private, held it behind the eyes, and she went on smiling for the soldiers. She learned, at 15, to feel one thing completely and to show another. She learned that composure meant carrying pain in silence, holding it down where no one could see, and covering it over with a pleasant face. This is where the steel and the smile were forged together, not in a palace, and not in some later crisis of state, but in a Scottish castle during the First World War, in a girl who buried a brother and kept the ward laughing on the same afternoon. It is worth pausing on what that costs a person. A child who learns to hide her deepest feelings does not simply grow into a serene adult. She grows into someone for whom the mask is always ready and always on. The gift and the wound are the same thing. The composure that would one day make Elizabeth so loved, the ability to walk into any room and give it warmth, was built on an early refusal to let anyone see what she truly felt. She had trained herself to be unreadable. She would stay unreadable for the next 87 years. The family was practiced at concealment already. The Bowes-Lyons had spent generations learning to keep their private business behind castle walls. Elizabeth had grown up inside that habit of mind. The war simply handed her the personal version of it, the discipline of the composed face, and it fixed the pattern for good. The convalescent years did other work on her too. They pulled her out of the nursery and set her down among adults, among suffering, among the raw facts of death and duty, at an age when most girls of her rank were still shielded from all of it. She grew up quickly. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, the sheltered child of the pre-war summers was gone. In her place stood a young woman with an unusual gift for people, an unusual self-command, and a store of grief she had already taught herself never to display. She had learned what she was for. In that ward, she had found a purpose, which was to be the one who steadied the room, the one who carried the mood, the one everyone leaned on and no one thought to worry about. It was a role, and she had chosen it, and she would go on to play it on a national stage before she was finished. The thousands of wounded men who came through Glamis never knew it, but they were the first audience of the most beloved public figure Britain would produce in the whole of the coming century. The war ended when she was 18. The wounded left Glamis. The castle slowly returned to being a home, and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, no longer a child, stepped out into the London society of the 1920s, into the balls and the house parties of a generation thinned by the trenches. She was not a great beauty in the fashionable sense, and she did not need to be. People who met her did not forget her. There was a warmth in her that drew everyone near, and a stillness underneath it that gave nothing away. Men fell for her easily. She had learned, in the ward, exactly how to make a room love her. Among the young men who would cross her path in those years was a prince. He was the second son of the king. He was shy to the point of pain, and he stammered so badly that speaking in public was an agony for him. He stood always in the shadow of his glamorous older brother, the future Edward VIII. He was, in almost every way, the opposite of the easy, luminous girl from Glamis, and he was beginning to notice her. Chapter 3. The Bride Who Said No to a Prince. Twice a shy and stammering prince asked her to marry him, and twice she turned down a place inside the royal family. She was barely into her 20s, and she was in no hurry to belong to anyone. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had come out of the long war years at Glamis with a gift that drew people to her. She was warm, she was quick, she was funny. She listened as though the person in front of her were the only one in the room. Young men circled her at every dance and every country weekend, and she enjoyed it, and she guarded her freedom, and she was in no rush to trade the one for the other. Among the men who noticed her was the second son of the king. His name was Albert, though everyone who loved him called him Bertie. He was the second son of King George V, born to be the spare and not the heir. He carried himself like a man who had been told all his life that he was the lesser one. He stammered. Words caught in his throat and would not come, and the struggle showed on his face and cost him agonies whenever he had to speak in public. He was frail where his elder brother was glamorous. He was awkward where the Prince of Wales was easy, and he had fallen, quietly and completely, for the laughing girl from Glamis. Bertie decided early that he wanted to marry her. He believed she was the one woman who could make him happy. He needed her in a way that few men of his rank would ever admit. The stammer had taught him to doubt himself, and beside her the doubt seemed to lift a little. She steadied him. She made the hard things look possible. He was not offering her a throne, or so he told himself. He was offering her himself, and the family that came attached to him. This was not a man who found things easy, and he found this hardest of all, because the girl he wanted did not want the life he came wrapped in. In 1921, he asked her to marry him. She said no. The refusal was not unkind, and it was not a game. She liked him. She may already have loved him a little. But to marry Bertie was not simply to marry a shy and gentle man. It was to marry the House of Windsor. It was to step inside the royal family and never step out again. And Elizabeth had seen enough of that world to be afraid of it. She had grown up in a great family, but a private one. The Bowes-Lyons were old Scottish aristocracy, not royalty, and there was a wall between the two. Behind that wall, a person could still be herself. She could speak without every word being weighed. She could come and go as she pleased. She could grieve in her own time, as she had grieved for her brother Fergus, without a whole nation reading her face. To marry into the crown was to give all of that up. It was to be looked at forever. She had watched royal life from close enough to fear it. It was a life measured out by other people. Where to stand, what to wear, when to smile, and for how long. A royal wife belonged to the public before she belonged to herself, and once the doors closed behind her, they did not open again. There was no leaving the royal family. There was no ordinary afternoon, no unwatched year, no going back to being an ordinary girl. For a young woman who prized her own freedom above almost anything, it was a great deal to surrender, and she surrendered nothing lightly. It was, she feared, a cage, gilded and beautiful and locked from the outside. So she said no. She meant it. And Bertie was wounded, but he did not give up. He asked her again in 1922. She refused him a second time. By now the courtship had an audience. The royal family, once it settled on something, was patient, and it had settled on Elizabeth as the steadying wife the awkward prince so plainly needed. Bertie's persistence was remarkable for so diffident a man. He kept returning to Glamis. He kept writing. Twice turned down, he refused to look elsewhere. And in the end, that constancy was part of what moved her. Elizabeth spent those months weighing two lives against each other. On the one side was the freedom she loved, and the ordinary, unwatched happiness she might have had with an ordinary man. On the other was Bertie himself, kind, devoted, and visibly in need of her, and the awkward truth that she had come to care for him far more than she had meant to. She was not dazzled by the throne. The throne was the thing that frightened her. What decided her in the end was the man. In January 1923, she accepted him. The country took to her at once. Here was a fresh, smiling girl with no foreign title and no grand design, marrying the shy prince for what looked to everyone like love. The newspapers adored her before she had done a single thing. It was the first flicker of a gift she did not yet know she possessed, the gift of being loved by strangers. She barely noticed it. She was too busy being afraid of what she had agreed to. She told herself she was marrying Bertie, and not the institution behind him. She would spend the rest of her life discovering how little those two things could ever be pulled apart. The wedding was held at Westminster Abbey on the 26th of April, 1923. It was made a public occasion, a bride the ordinary people could see and cheer, and the crowds came out in their thousands along the route. The monarchy had come through the war shaken and uncertain of its place, and a young couple marrying for love was exactly the kind of warmth it needed the country to feel. Elizabeth, without quite intending to, was already doing the work that would one day define her. She walked up the long aisle of the Abbey, past rows of the most important people in the empire. And then she did something that no one had instructed her to do, something that belonged entirely to her. As she entered, she laid her bouquet down on the grave of the unknown warrior. The tomb held the body of a nameless soldier, carried home from the battlefields of France to stand for every man who never came back. Elizabeth had given one of her own to that war. Her brother Fergus had been killed at Lewes in 1915, and she had learned as a girl to fold her grief away behind a composed and cheerful face. Now, on the morning of her wedding, in front of the whole watching country, she set her flowers on the grave of a soldier with no name, in memory of a brother whose name was everything to her. It was a small act, and a deliberate one, and it told the truth about her more plainly than all the pageantry around it. Every royal bride who followed her repeated the gesture. She was the first to make it. When she rose from the altar, she was no longer simply Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon of Glamis. She was Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of York, the wife of the King's second son, and a working member of the House of Windsor for the rest of her days. The wall she had grown up behind was gone. She stood on the far side of it now, inside the family, one of the watched. The cage she had feared had closed around her, gently, with cheering crowds and a wedding march. And yet she had walked into it with her eyes open, twice refusing before she chose it. And she had chosen it for a man and not for a crown. That distinction mattered to her. She had married the spare, not the heir, and being the spare came with an unexpected mercy. Because Bertie stood second in line and not first, the couple were left a measure of quiet that the future king could never be given. They were free to make a home. They were free, for a little while longer, to be nobody very important. That freedom, strange to say, was where Elizabeth would find the happiest years of her whole long life. Ahead of her lay a quiet house in London, the soft, ordinary rhythm of a family of her own, and a private world she would come to guard every bit as fiercely as she would one day guard the throne. For 13 years, the cage would feel almost like liberty. She could not have known, smiling in the Abbey that April morning, how brief that gift would turn out to be. Chapter 4. The happiest house in London. For 13 years, she had the one thing the rest of her life would never give her again, an ordinary and private happiness. She had married the second son. That was the whole secret of it. On the 26th of April, 1923, she walked into Westminster Abbey and came out as the Duchess of York, wife of Prince Albert, the shy man his family called Bertie. He was the spare, not the heir. His elder brother, Edward, the glamorous Prince of Wales, stood between Bertie and the throne. And so the young Duchess could tell herself that the crown she had feared was a distant thing. It was someone else's burden. It was a shadow that fell on another house. For a while she was right. Their home was a tall townhouse at 145 Piccadilly in the heart of London, looking out over Hyde Park. It was grand by any ordinary measure and modest by royal ones. There were no staterooms, there was no throne, no ancient weight of ceremony pressing down on the stairs. There was a nursery at the top of the house, a small library, a morning room. For a royal residence, it was almost a family home. In the country there was Royal Lodge, a large pink-washed house in Windsor Great Park, where the Duke dug in the garden and the Duchess planted, and the days went slow. These were the walls inside which she was happiest. She knew it even then. The first child came on the 21st of April, 1926. A daughter, Elizabeth. She was born third in line behind her own father, a long way from the throne, a baby no one expected to reign. The Duchess adored her. 4 years later, on the 21st of August, 1930, a second daughter arrived and was christened Margaret Rose. Now the family was complete. 2 parents, 2 little girls. The Duchess had a private name for the 4 of them. She called them "We 4." It was more than a fond phrase. It was a fortress. Inside those 4 walls of family she felt safe, and she guarded that closeness with everything she had. The husband at the centre of it needed guarding most of all. Bertie was nervous, frail, and cursed with a stammer that turned every public word into an ordeal. He would stand to speak, and the words would lock in his throat while a nation waited. It shamed him, it frightened him, and it fell to his wife to steady him. In the middle of the 1920s, they found the man who would change everything, an Australian speech therapist named Lionel Logue. Logue held no grand medical title. He worked with breath, with rhythm, with patience. Slowly, he gave the Duke back his own voice. The Duchess sat in on the exercises. She learned the pauses. When Bertie faltered in public, it was her calm face he searched the room for, and her steadiness he leaned on. She had married a man the world thought weak, and she had quietly made herself his strength. Then, in 1927, the wider world got its first proper look at her. The Duke and Duchess were sent on a long tour of Australia and New Zealand. It meant months away on the far side of the earth, a voyage by sea to the other end of the empire. It also meant leaving their baby daughter behind. Elizabeth was barely a year old when her parents sailed. For the Duchess, who lived for that small family circle, the parting was a wound. But the tour did something no one had quite predicted. It revealed her gift. She was a natural. In town after town, she stepped from the car, and the crowds simply warmed to her. She had an ease with ordinary people that the stiff royal manner had never allowed. She would catch a stranger's eye and hold it a beat longer than she needed to, and that stranger would go home feeling chosen. She remembered faces. She remembered names. She could stand in the rain for an hour and make every person in the line believe the day had been arranged for them. The smile that a nation would one day love was already there, doing its quiet work, long before the pastel coats and the gentle gloved wave became her trademark. Bertie, the shy one, watched his wife win a continent and understood how much he needed her. That gift only deepened through the early 1930s. Back home from the tour, she carried it into hospital visits, garden parties, and the small daily duties that fill a royal life. Crowds gathered wherever the Duchess went. She never seemed to tire of them, and they never seemed to tire of her. The palace machinery noticed. The newspapers noticed. Here was a royal woman who made the institution feel human, who could turn a formal handshake into something that felt almost like friendship. It was a talent, and she was refining it into a craft. She did not yet know how much the country would one day need it. She only knew that it worked, and that it belonged entirely to her. That was the pattern of the 13 years. The dutiful wife of the spare, the steady hand behind the stammering duke, the mother of 2 small girls in a happy house on Piccadilly. She was popular, she was useful, and, crucially, she was not central. Her days were her own. She could take breakfast with her daughters, walk the gardens at Royal Lodge, and close the door on the wider world when it suited her. She had made a bargain with royal life, and, for a time, it held. She gave the crown her charm and her loyalty, and in return, the crown left her the one thing she wanted most, a private world it could not reach. But a shadow was gathering at the edge of that world, and it wore the face of her husband's own brother. Edward, the Prince of Wales, was the most admired man in the empire. He was handsome, restless, and modern, and the newspapers adored him. He was also, as the years passed, unmarried and increasingly unhappy in the role fate had handed him. By the middle of the 1930s, the heir to the throne had become entangled with a married American woman named Wallis Simpson. She was twice divorced. She was clever and sharp and entirely outside the world the royal family understood. Edward could not let her go. The family watched with a deepening unease that no one dared say aloud. For the Duchess of York, safe in her nursery on Piccadilly, this was not distant gossip. It was arithmetic. Everything she treasured stood only 2 lives from the throne. The first was the old king, George V, Bertie's father, who was aging and ailing and worried to his bones about the son who would follow him. The second was Edward himself, and Edward was making choices that no king had ever been permitted to make. As long as the heir did his duty and married suitably and produced children of his own, the crown would pass down his line and never come near her husband. That was the wall between the York family and the throne, and that wall was beginning to crack. She could see it coming in a way the country could not. The public knew Edward as the Golden Prince. The Duchess knew him as the man whose private passion could pull the whole structure down and drop its weight on the frail shoulders of her Bertie. She had refused this world twice before she entered it, precisely because she feared the cage. Now she watched the cage door swinging toward the man she loved, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Still, for a few more months, the happiness held. The little princesses grew. Elizabeth was serious and careful, Margaret quick and bright. The Duke practiced his speeches with Logue's patient methods and grew steadier at the microphone. The Duchess entertained and charmed, and kept the private fortress of We Four intact behind its warm and smiling front. If she was afraid of what lay ahead, she did what she had always done. She hid it behind a composed and cheerful face and let no one see the fear underneath. Then the old king died. In January 1936, George V passed away, and the reign that had held the family in place for a quarter of a century was over. His eldest son became King Edward VIII. In a single stroke, the distance the Duchess had counted on collapsed. The old king was gone. Only one life now stood between Bertie and the throne, and it belonged to a new king who cared more for a divorced American than for the crown on his own head. The woman at Edward's side was Wallis Simpson. She was about to move to the very centre of the story, and the Duchess of York, who had spent 13 years building the happiest house in London, was about to learn that no wall she raised could keep it safe. The years of We Four were ending. The reckoning that would make her a queen and mark her enemy for life had already begun. Chapter 5. The Throne. No one wanted. In the space of a single December, her brother-in-law threw away a crown, and her stammering husband was made to carry it. 1936 became the year of 3 kings. It opened in grief. The old king, George V, died that January, and his eldest son took the throne as Edward VIII. He was handsome, restless, and adored by the crowds who lined the streets to see him. He was also in love. The woman was an American called Wallis Simpson, and she was twice divorced. That single fact made everything impossible. A twice-divorced woman could not be crowned beside the King of England, and neither the family nor the government would have her. Edward would not give her up. For most of the country, that was the end of the matter. For Edward, it was only the start of a decision. Elizabeth watched it come. She was the Duchess of York then, wife of the second son, the spare who was never meant to matter. From the outside, her life looked settled and small and content. She had built a private world of her own, and she had built it on purpose, because she knew what royal life could take from a person. She had once refused to enter this family at all. Twice a shy prince had asked her to marry him, and twice she had said no, frightened of the cage. She had walked in with her eyes open, believing she was marrying the son who would never be king. Now that belief was coming apart in front of her. She was not born to any of this, and that mattered. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had come from old Scottish aristocracy, from Glamis and its long history, but her family was not royal. She had married into the crown from the outside, by her own choice, and people who choose a thing often guard it harder than those born to it. She defended the monarchy with the zeal of a convert. Now the institution she had chosen to protect was being damaged by 2 people who had put their own longing above their duty to it. To Elizabeth, that was close to unforgivable. Duty was the whole point. It was the thing she had given up her freedom for. Through the autumn, the pressure built and did not break. Edward wanted Wallis and the throne together, and he was told he could not have both. He chose her. On the 11th of December 1936, Edward VIII gave up the crown. He signed the throne away, chose the woman over the country, and left. He became the Duke of Windsor, an ex-king bound for exile in France, and the crown he had let fall had to land on someone. Nothing like it had happened before. The abdication of 1936 was the greatest shock the monarchy had suffered in the whole century. A king walking off the throne of his own free will in peacetime for love. Thrones passed by death, not by choice. This one had changed hands twice in a single year, from father to son in January and from one brother to the other in December. The old certainty that the crown simply endured, above the mess of ordinary lives, had been broken in public. For a moment, the family Elizabeth had married into looked as though it might not hold. The weight of it landed on Albert. Albert was Elizabeth's husband, the gentle, frail, frightened second son who had never wanted any of it. He stammered. He had spent years fighting for control of his own voice, dreading the microphones and the crowds his brother had commanded so easily. He was not made for the throne, and everyone close to him knew it, and none of it counted now. His brother had walked away, and the law put the crown in his hands, whether he wished it or not. On the 11th of December 1936, he became King George VI, and Elizabeth, who had never expected it and had never wanted it, became queen. She did not feel the moment as a victory. She felt it as a theft. Something had been taken from her husband and from the small family she guarded, and someone had done the taking. In her mind, the guilty party was not really Edward, weak and love-struck as he was. It was the woman he had chosen. Wallis Simpson had come into the monarchy from nowhere, unsettled it, emptied a throne, and left a frail man to shoulder the weight. That was how Elizabeth saw it, and it hardly mattered whether the picture was fair. She would go on seeing it that way for the rest of her life. This is where the fury was born, and it was not a passing thing. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had a long memory and an unforgiving one. In that December, a grudge took root in her that 60 years would not soften. She looked at the husband she loved, and she believed he had been handed a burden that would wear him down and use him up. Kings of England were not supposed to be nervous, reluctant men. This one was. She was certain the strain would cost him, and whatever it cost him, she decided the bill belonged to Wallis. She barely spoke the woman's name again. To the end of her days, she called her only that woman. The first stroke of that long, quiet war came within months. When Edward left, he kept his royal rank. In 1937, the new king signed letters patent that named his brother His Royal Highness, the Duke of Windsor. But the same document drew a hard line through his wife. It denied the style Her Royal Highness to Wallis, and to any children the couple might have. She had married a king's son and a king's brother, and she would never be curtsied to as one of them. It was a small, exact, permanent wound, and it was the first mark of a shutting out that would last for decades. Elizabeth is very widely credited with hardening her husband's resolve on that point. The king held the pen. Many believed the will behind it was hers. Look at the strange shape of what had happened. Elizabeth had refused royal life twice, out of fear of exactly this, the loss of freedom, the end of a private self. She had said yes only because she thought she was marrying the safe brother, the one who would stand off to the side. Now the side had become the centre. The catastrophe she never chose had made her queen, not only queen. When George VI was proclaimed, she became queen and Empress of India, consort to the ruler of an empire that still reached around the world. The disaster that had wrecked her family had crowned her. The two things were the same event. She would spend the rest of her life inside that paradox, adored because of the very thing she could never forgive. The ordinary happiness of the Duchess years was over. The London house, the quiet mornings with her two small girls, the sense of being a family off to one side of history, all of it was finished, swept away in a single month. The abdication took it, and it never came back. And now the weaker of the two brothers had the throne, and he could not face it alone. Albert leaned on his wife entirely. Where his voice failed, hers held. Where his nerve went, she supplied it. In the frightening weeks after the abdication, he turned to her as he turned to her for everything, and she did not flinch. She had married a prince who was never meant to reign. She would now make a king of him, one careful day at a time, because there was no one else to do it, and because she had decided the family would survive. Something in her set hard in those weeks and never loosened again. The soft manner stayed. The steel underneath was fixed. She had a husband who was terrified of the part in front of him. She had a country unsettled by a king who had walked out on it. She had an empire watching to see whether this nervous man and his untried wife could hold the throne between them. Whatever came next, it would fall to her to carry him through it, and she knew it. There was a date already waiting. Edward had chosen the 12th of May, 1937, for his own crowning, and now that same day would be used to crown the brother who had taken his place. A coronation was coming. A frightened king had to be turned into the picture of a king, and a wary, wounded nation had to be made to love him. Elizabeth understood, better than anyone else in the family, that love was the one force that could save them all. And love, she was beginning to see, was something a person could build. Chapter 6. The Making of a Beloved Queen. She understood something the rest of the family did not, that a crown survives on love, and love can be built. The rest of them still thought a monarchy ran on blood and duty. Elizabeth knew better. She had just watched a king walk away from the throne for a woman, and she had seen how little the ancient machinery of the crown could do to stop him. Duty had not held Edward. Blood had not held him. Something else would have to hold the throne now, something warmer and far harder to argue with. She decided what it would be. Affection. Not the cold respect owed to a distant sovereign, but real love from ordinary people, built on purpose and kept in good repair. It was a strange thing for a queen to grasp so early. Most of her class thought love was something a monarch simply received. She understood it was something a monarch had to earn. It began with a date. When the plans were laid for the coronation of King George VI, the day chosen was the 12th of May, 1937. It was not a new date. It was the exact day already set aside for Edward VIII to be crowned, before he gave the crown away. The invitations had been printed. The route through London had been planned. The stands had been built. Rather than waste any of it, the new king and queen simply stepped into the day their predecessor had abandoned and made it their own. There was a quiet message buried in that reuse. The man was gone. The monarchy went on schedule, as though he had never been more than a name to cross out. Inside Westminster Abbey, she knelt beside her stammering husband and was anointed queen. In that single morning, the shy Duchess of York became Queen Elizabeth, and Empress of India besides. Think of what she carried up that aisle. As a young woman, she had refused this family twice, frightened of the cage that royal life would close around her. Now the cage had shut for good, and there was no walking out of it. So she made the decision that would shape the rest of her long life. If she could not escape the role, she would master it more completely than anyone who had worn it before her. She would not merely occupy the throne, she would make the country adore whoever sat on it. The craft showed first in what she wore. She built a look, and she never once let it go. Soft pastel coats, pale feathered hats, long gloves, and a gentle wave that somehow seemed to reach each single person in a crowd of thousands. It read as grandmotherly before she was anywhere near old enough to be a grandmother, and it was entirely deliberate. The colours were chosen so that she stood out against the grey of a British street, so that the eye found her at once. so that a child lifted onto a father's shoulders would remember a soft blue figure smiling straight at them. The clothes were a signal, and the signal never changed. Here is someone gentle. Here is someone kind. Here is someone no one need fear. Behind the pastel stood a woman with an iron will and a memory that forgave nothing. The public would never be shown that woman. The public was shown the powder blue. She had always been easy with crowds. What changed after the coronation was that ease became a strategy. She learned to slow her walk so that a line of waiting people lasted longer. She learned to pause, to ask a real question, to let one ordinary person feel chosen for a moment out of the mass. It looked effortless. It was work. Every warm glance was a small deposit, and she understood, better than any advisor around her, that a throne saved by borrowed emotion in 1936 would need a vast reserve of the genuine kind to survive whatever came next. So she set about building that reserve, and the greatest test of it came in the summer before the war. Consider the span of what she pulled off. On the 11th of December 1936, her husband became king, unprepared and afraid. On the 12th of May 1937, the two of them were crowned, on the very day Edward had chosen and thrown aside. 2 years after that, from the 17th of May to the 15th of June 1939, they crossed an entire ocean and then an entire continent. It was the first time in history that a reigning British monarch had ever set foot in North America. They travelled from Quebec in the east all the way to the Pacific coast in the west, and then turned south into the United States. Nearly a full month of crowds, on a journey no king before them had dared to make. The tour was not a holiday, and it was not really about ceremony. It was about war. Everyone with sense could feel the storm coming in Europe, and the government understood that when it came, Britain would need friends across the Atlantic. So the king and queen were sent to win them. They were living propaganda in the best sense, sent to put a human face on a distant island and to bind North American sympathy to Britain before the shooting started. In the United States, they went to Washington and then to the private home of President Franklin Roosevelt at Hyde Park. There, at a picnic, the President of the United States served the King of England hot dogs, and the newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic loved every single second of it. Here was the crowned head of a great empire, sitting on a summer lawn, eating plain food off a paper plate like any other guest. The stiff old empire had arrived, and it had arrived smiling. Elizabeth was the reason it worked. Crowds that had come out of curiosity stayed out of warmth. She did in Canada and America exactly what she had learned to do on a London street, only now on a scale that touched millions and reached across a border. Reporters who expected a remote European queen found a woman who looked delighted to be among them, who seemed to like people, and who made an old institution feel suddenly approachable. By the time the royal train pulled back towards home, the mood had shifted. Sympathy had been won. When she looked back on it later, she summed up the whole month in 2 small words. The tour, she said, had made them, not helped them, not merely gone well. It had made them. She knew precisely what had happened on that trip. She had discovered that her true gift was the management of public affection on a mass scale, and that this gift, and not her birth, was the real source of her power. That is the question this whole part of her life poses, and it is not a comfortable one. Was the warmth the world adored a gift or a craft? The honest answer is that it was both at the same time, and that she never let the seam between them show. She genuinely liked crowds. She genuinely lit up in front of a waiting street. But she also knew exactly what that light was worth, and she spent it as carefully as a banker spends capital. The smile was real, and the smile was a tool. Both things were true. That is what made her so formidable and so hard to see clearly. A false performer gets found out. She never did, because there was nothing false in it to find. There was only warmth, aimed with the cold precision of a woman who had learned in one December how quickly a throne could fall. She came home in the summer of 1939, the most popular queen Britain had known in living memory. She had turned a family disgraced by abdication into a family the country was ready to love again. She had built, out of pastel cloth and patient smiles, a reservoir of affection deep enough to carry the monarchy through almost anything. And she had built it, as it turned out, only just in time. Within weeks of her return, the reservoir would be needed. In September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, and the gentle grandmother in powder blue found that everything she had made was about to be tested by fire. She would not run from it. She would do the opposite. In the years just ahead, the bombs would fall on the poorest streets of London, and then on her own palace. And the woman who had learned to build love would learn what it was worth under fire. An enemy across the Channel was said to have watched her closely and to have given her a title of his own. Not the beloved queen, the most dangerous woman in Europe. Chapter 7. The woman Hitler feared. When the bombs fell on her own palace, she said she was glad, because now she could look the poor in the eye. It was the 13th of September 1940. The war was a year old, and it had come home. For weeks, the German bombers had crossed the Channel by day and by night. London was burning. The docks were alight. Whole streets in the poorest districts of the East had been reduced to brick and dust. Families were sleeping in cellars and underground stations, listening for the drone overhead. And on that grey September day, the war came for the King and Queen in person. High explosive bombs fell on Buckingham Palace while they were inside it. The King and Queen were together in a small room upstairs. The windows burst inward. Glass flew across the floor. The bombs struck the inner courtyard of the palace, close enough that they heard the whistle of them coming down. For a few seconds, the two most protected people in Britain were as helpless as anyone under a falling sky. A moment later, and the story of the century might have ended in that courtyard. She did not flee. That was the first thing. She did not pack the family off to safety and rule the country from a distance. And she did not pretend it had not happened. In the days that followed, she spoke the words that would attach themselves to her name for the rest of her life. She was glad, she said, that the palace had been bombed. Now she could look the East End in the face. It was a remarkable thing to say. It was also a very deliberate thing to say. The East End was the part of London taking the worst of the raids. It was where the docks were, and the crowded terraces, and the poor with nowhere safe to send their children. Those people had every reason to resent a queen behind high palace walls. One sentence dissolved that resentment in a breath. She had been bombed too. Her home had been hit too. For that one terrible autumn, she was one of them. That was the gift she had, and she understood exactly what it was worth. She had spent years learning that a crown survives on love, and that love can be built. Now the bombs handed her the greatest chance she would ever have to build it. A frightened country did not need a distant sovereign. It needed a mother who stayed. So she stayed, and she made certain the country knew she had stayed. What that cost her privately, she never let the public see. The palace was hit more than once across the war, and each raid was a reminder that a single bomb could end the whole family in an instant. She was a woman of 40, with 2 young daughters and a frail husband whose nerves had never been strong. Any part of her that wanted to run was kept behind the same composed face she showed the crowds. Fear was a private thing. It went where the grief had always gone, behind the smile, where no one was allowed to look. Long before the palace was struck, she had already made the choice that defined her war. There had been pressure to send the two young princesses across the Atlantic to Canada, far beyond the reach of the bombs. Wealthy families were doing exactly that. It would have been the safe and sensible thing. She refused. The children, she said, would not leave without her. She would not leave without the king. And the king would never leave. So the whole family stayed inside the target. Elizabeth and Margaret were sent instead to Windsor Castle, and there they spent most of the war, out of the worst of the danger, but never out of the country. Their mother and their father remained in London by choice. To a nation that had no choice at all, that decision was worth more than any speech. The king and queen were in the same war as everyone else. They had gambled their own daughter's safety on the same island. It bound the crown to the people with a rope that would not fray for 60 years. Consider the arithmetic of that autumn. She was 40 years old. She had been a queen for less than 4 years, crowned only in 1937. The war itself was just 1 year old. Her elder daughter, Elizabeth, was 14. Her younger, Margaret, was only 10. Both girls were kept at Windsor while their mother stayed in the bombed capital. And on the 13th of September 1940, high explosive bombs fell on Buckingham Palace with the king and queen still inside it. A reign of 3 years. A family of 4. 1 palace. Hit. That was the ledger of the most loved queen Britain would ever produce. What the country remembered most were the walks. She went out into the bombed districts on foot, into the rubble of streets that had been hit the night before, while the dust was still settling and the fires still smoked. And she came dressed as she always dressed, the soft pastel coats, the feathered hats, colour picking its way through the grey. Some thought it strange to step through broken glass in heels and powder blue. She thought about it very carefully. The people standing in the wreckage of their homes did not want a queen in mourning black. They wanted a queen who looked as though the world could still be mended. So she gave them the smile, and the gloved wave, and the pastel, and she walked toward them instead of away. She would stop and speak to a woman who had lost her house. She would ask an old man where he would sleep that night. She listened. She did not hurry. And the photographs of it went everywhere. The small, bright figure among the ruined bricks. And they did more for the war effort than a fleet of aircraft. The powder blue had become armour. Behind it, whatever fear she felt stayed hidden, exactly as she had learned to hide grief in a great hall full of wounded men a generation before. By now, she was more than a queen. She was a symbol, and the enemy is said to have noticed. It was said then, and it is still repeated now, that Adolf Hitler called her the most dangerous woman in Europe. Whether he ever spoke those words is far from certain, and the line is best treated for what it is, a piece of wartime legend rather than proven history. But a legend fixes itself only to a person who has earned it. If the German war effort ran on breaking British will, then a woman who could keep a bombed and burning city from despair with a smile and a pastel coat was, in her own way, a genuine threat. The story survived because it felt true. That is why she kept it. These were the years that made her. The affection she earned in the Blitz was the deepest and most durable thing she ever built. And she knew it even as she was building it. It was banked, and she would draw on that account for the rest of her long life. Everything that came after, the racing, the grand old age, the gilded households, the adoration of a nation that never once turned on her, rested on this single foundation of shared danger. The country had watched her stand in the rubble and refused to leave. After that, it would forgive her almost anything. She had spent her own safety and her children's, and bought something no amount of money could purchase. A love that would outlast the war, the empire, and the century itself. This was the peak. The smiling queen in the ruins, glad to have been bombed, unbowed and unhurried, was the image at its most flawless. Nothing about it was false. She truly did stay. She truly did walk the wreckage. The courage was real, and so was the calculation, and in her the two were never separate things. And yet even here, at the very summit of the beloved image, the old family instinct was still quietly at work in the background. While the queen walked the ruined streets as the mother of a wounded nation, comforting strangers who had lost everything they owned, two people of her own blood were about to lose everything too. Quietly, out of sight, far from any camera. Within a year of the bombs falling on her palace, two of her own nieces would be shut away behind institution walls, and the family would begin the slow, careful work of erasing them from the record altogether. The warm face the whole country adored had a colder side, and it reached all the way into her own household. Chapter 8. The Nieces Who Were Declared Dead. While she reigned as the warm face of the family, two of her own blood were shut away and written down as dead. Their names were Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon. Nerissa was born on the 18th of February 1919. Catherine came 7 years later, on the 4th of July 1926. Their father was John Herbert Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother's own brother. That made these two girls her nieces, her close blood, born into the same old Scottish family and carrying the same name that would soon stand for warmth and duty across the whole of Britain. They were not distant cousins in a forgotten branch. They were the daughters of the man she had grown up beside. Both girls were born with severe learning disabilities. In the blunt language of that time, each was classified as an imbecile. Neither of them ever learned to speak. They understood little of the world around them, and the world, in return, decided it had no use for them. In a family that measured its worth by appearances, by the marriages made and the photographs taken and the titles carried well, two silent girls who would never curtsy to a king had no obvious place. The Bowes-Lyon name was built for display. Nerissa and Catherine could not be displayed. For a while, they lived in the ordinary care of their family. Then, in 1941, they were sent away. Both were placed in the Royal Earlswood Hospital at Redhill, in Surrey, an institution for people with mental disabilities. It was the middle of the war. That same season, their aunt was the most loved woman in the country, walking the bombed streets of the East End in her soft pastel coats, promising a frightened nation that the family on the throne suffered alongside it. While the Queen offered her face to the poor of London, two of her own nieces disappeared behind the walls of a Surrey asylum, and there, in the records that mattered most to their class, they were quietly erased. There was nothing rare in that generation about a great family sending a disabled child away. It was the ordinary cruelty of the age, dressed up as care. Children who could not fit the shape a family needed were placed in institutions and visited less and less, until the visits stopped altogether. What set the Bowes-Lyon case apart came in the second act. Someone took the further step of writing the two women out of existence while they still lived. The family could have kept them quietly, out of the papers and out of the way. Instead, it reached for the most complete silence there is, the silence of the grave, and laid it over two people who were still breathing. The erasure was no whisper passed at dinner. It was set down in print, in the one book the British aristocracy treated as gospel. Burke's Peerage was the great register of the titled families, the volume that recorded every birth, marriage, and death that counted. To be entered in Burke's was to exist. The edition published in 1963 recorded that Nerissa Bowes-Lyon had died in 1940 and that Catherine had died in 1961. Both entries were false. Both women were alive. They were living at that very moment inside Royal Earlswood, breathing and eating and aging, while the official record of their own family declared them gone. Consider the shape of it in numbers. Nerissa was born in 1919, Catherine in 1926. In 1941, aged 22 and 15, they entered Royal Earlswood. The family's recorded contribution to their care was £125 a year. In 1963, Burke's Peerage listed them as dead, dating Nerissa's death to 1940 and Catherine's to 1961, years before either had died. Nerissa, in truth, lived until 1986. Catherine lived until 2014. For decades, then, two women existed on the wrong side of their own family's ledger, alive in fact and dead on paper. £125 a year. That was the sum recorded for their keeping. Set it beside the world their aunt inhabited. A queen with pages and footmen and dressers, a celebrated cellar, a stable of racehorses, an entire wardrobe of feathered hats maintained at real expense. The gap between those two figures says almost everything the story needs to say. The most costly public warmth in Britain and the cheapest possible silence over two forgotten girls running side by side down the same century, inside the same family. It is worth being careful about what the record proves and what it does not. The documents do not place a pen in the Queen Mother's hand and show her writing her nieces out of Burke's Peerage. The concealment was the work of the wider Bowes-Lyon world, the quiet machinery of a family that knew how to close a door. What is documented, and beyond dispute, is that the door stayed closed for the whole of her long reign as the beloved face of that family. While she smiled from the balcony and gave her gentle gloved wave, two of her nieces sat forgotten in Surrey, and the family's own book of record insisted they were dead. Nerissa never lived to see the truth come out. She died in 1986, inside the world that had hidden her, a woman who had spent almost her entire life shut away, and had never, in any sense the outside knew, been allowed to exist at all. Catherine outlasted her by nearly 3 decades, living on until 2014. Neither of them ever spoke a word that history recorded. Their whole story is told about them, never by them, which is its own kind of erasure. The silence finally broke in 1987. It was the Sun newspaper that exposed it, printing the fact that the Queen Mother had nieces who had been declared dead in Burke's Peerage decades before their real deaths. The country that adored the smiling grandmother of the nation learned that her own family had struck its disabled children from the record. For millions who had never questioned the powder blue and the gentle wave, it was the first glimpse of something colder underneath. Here was proof, in black and white, that this was a family with a practiced talent for making inconvenient people disappear. The timing of the revelation carried its own sting. It came in 1987, when the Queen Mother was in her late 80s and more cherished than ever, the grand old survivor of a vanished age. The public had spent half a century loving a single picture of her. Now a second picture sat beside it, harder to look at and impossible to forget. That talent was not new. It was the oldest habit of the house she came from. For generations, the Strathmores had been rumoured to hide a secret behind the walls of Glamis, a story of a family that buried what it could not explain. The rumour was only ever legend. Nerissa and Catherine were not. They were real women, with birthdays and a father and a bloodline that ran straight back to the Queen Mother, and they were treated as the legend said the monster had been treated, shut away and spoken of as dead. The instinct to bury the difficult truth, to protect the name at any human cost, ran through the whole of her family, and it had shaped her. She had learned it young, in a great house that smiled at the door and locked its secrets behind the wall. This is the widest the gap ever opens between the two women she was. On one side, the queen the public worshipped, the face that made an ancient and privileged institution feel like family. On the other, a household that could pay £125 a year to keep its own blood out of sight and let a reference book call them dead. The warmth was real to millions. The silence was real too. Both belonged to the same person and the same family, and both ran the length of the same century. The nation saw one. Only the family knew the other. She would carry that instinct for concealment to the end of her days, this reflex to guard the name and control the story whatever it cost the people inside it. And very soon it would be tested by a loss she could not hide behind any smile. The man she had married, the shy prince she had twice refused and then spent her life protecting, was already unwell. Within a few short years, the strain of the crown would take him, and she would be left a widow at the height of her fame, alone and searching for someone to blame. What that grief became, and the name she gave in private to the couple she held responsible, is the story of the years that followed. Chapter 9. The king is dead, and she has a name for who killed him. When her husband died at 56, she did not call it illness. She called it murder by abdication. The date was the 6th of February, 1952. The place was Sandringham, the royal house in Norfolk, where the family had gathered at Christmas and stayed on into the hard cold of a Norfolk winter. George VI had gone up to bed the night before in good spirits. He had spent the last day of his life out in the frosted fields, shooting hares in the winter air, a frail man doing the thing he loved. Sometime in the dark, his heart stopped. He died in his sleep, alone, worn out at 56 years old. The cause traced back to the surgery of the previous autumn, an operation for lung cancer, the disease of a man who had smoked heavily all his life. A servant found him in the morning. The king was gone before anyone could reach the bed. His wife was under the same roof. She was Queen Elizabeth, 51 years old, and in a single morning she became a widow. Their marriage had lasted almost 29 years, ever since the wedding at Westminster Abbey on the 26th of April, 1923. She had refused him twice before she agreed to marry him. She had spent every year since holding up a shy and stammering man who had never wanted a throne and had leaned on her for the strength to carry one. Lionel Logue had taught his mouth to manage the words. She had taught the rest of him to stand. Now the crown had finished with him, and she was left standing beside the bed with nothing left to hold. The nation saw a widow in black. The powder blue was put away in the wardrobe. For weeks she barely appeared, and when she did, the famous smile had gone somewhere no camera could find. Yet the private woman was not only grieving, she was reaching a verdict, and she would spend the rest of her life refusing to overturn it. She had watched the whole thing happen from the front row. She had watched her brother-in-law walk away from the crown in December 1936 to marry a twice-divorced American. She had watched the weight of it drop onto her own husband, a second son who had been raised to stand behind the throne, not on it. Albert had become King George VI on the 11th of December 1936, and from that day, in her private accounting, a clock had begun to run down on his life. 15 years of a task he had never been built to bear. The war, the bombing of his own palace, the strain that never once let up. In her mind, the sum was simple, and it was final. The crown had been forced on a reluctant man, and the forcing had killed him. So she did not blame the cancer. She did not truly blame the cigarettes, though he had smoked them by the packet for decades. She blamed two people. She blamed the man who had thrown the crown away, and she blamed the woman he had thrown it away for. In her mind, they had made her Bertie a king, and being king had made him a corpse at 56. It was not the reasoning of a coroner. It was the reasoning of a wife who had married into the crown from the outside and guarded it with a convert's fury. In the raw months after Sandringham, the grief did not widen into forgiveness. It narrowed to a single point, found a target across the channel, and settled there for good. Consider the plain arithmetic of the loss. He was 56. They had been married for almost 29 years, since the 26th of April, 1923. He had worn the crown for 15 of them, crowned in 1937, and dead by the 6th of February, 1952. He had come to the throne at 40 and left it in a coffin at 56. Their two daughters, born in 1926 and 1930, had grown up watching their father wear himself thin. The elder was 25 and away in Kenya when he died, and she flew home a queen. In one night, the woman who had built the family around him lost the man at its centre. For a time, she seemed to lose herself as well. Her daughter was the sovereign now, Queen Elizabeth II, and a mother had to step back and become the Queen Mother, a title that named exactly what she had ceased to be. The rooms at Buckingham Palace passed to the next reign, and she would move out to Clarence House the following year, in 1953. She was 51 years old, with 50 more years still ahead of her, though no living soul could have guessed it. Some who knew her feared she might withdraw from public life altogether. The whole engine of her existence had been the protection of one fragile man, and that man was in the ground at Windsor. The question that hung over the widow was cruel, and it was simple. What was she for now? The answer came out of the far north of Scotland, from the emptiest corner of the mainland. Later that same year, in 1952, still deep in her mourning, she travelled up to Caithness to stay with friends near the very top of the country. There, on a bleak shelf of the north coast facing the grey race of the Pentland Firth, she was shown a ruin. It was called Barragill Castle, a battered tower house standing alone against the sea wind. It was semi-derelict. Only the tower itself was still truly fit to live in. It had no electricity and no running water. By any sensible measure, it was a wreck that no widow in the roar of grief should take on. She decided to buy it. The choice told more about her than any words of comfort could. She did not want ease. She wanted a task large enough to fill the hole. She bought the ruin, renamed it the Castle of May, and set about dragging it back from collapse stone by stone. The main work of making it weathertight, plastered and painted was carried out across 1953 and 1954. She had electricity and water installed for the first time in the building's long history. The restoration of the West Wing was not finished until 1960. Room by room, the woman who had not been able to save her husband saved a house instead, and in the saving of it, she saved herself. May became her refuge and her proof at once. From 1955 onward, she went there faithfully every August and October, the same rhythm year upon year, walking the garden she had walled against the endless wind, watching the ships slide across the Firth. It was the one place that was wholly hers, rescued with her own will and owing nothing to the throne that had swallowed her husband whole. Her final stay came in October 2001, when she was 101 years old. Long before then, in July 1996, she had made the castle and its farm over to a trust that keeps its doors open to visitors to this day. The rescue of a castle, though, did not soften the verdict she carried. It simply ran alongside it, year after year. A grief that finds no natural end has to travel somewhere, and hers travelled into judgment. She would live for another half-century, and across every one of those years she held the same private conviction, unaltered and unforgiven. Her Bertie had been a well-enough man made mortally ill. A reluctant king had been worked into an early grave, and the fault, as she saw it, lay with the couple who had pressed the crown into his hands and then sailed off to a soft and sunlit exile in France, while her husband stayed behind to do the dying. She never once said it from a platform. She smiled her way through 50 more years of christenings and garden parties and race meetings, and the powder blue came back out of the wardrobe as bright as ever. But behind the pastel and the gentle gloved wave, the ledger stayed open and the account went unsettled. There was one name in particular she would not let cross her lips. She called the woman across the channel only that woman, and she now had 3 long decades of widowhood stretching in front of her, in which to make certain that woman stayed exactly where the Queen Mother had decided she belonged. Not brought home, not forgiven, on the outside, and there for good. Chapter 10. The War on That Woman. For more than 30 years, she made sure the woman she blamed stayed exactly where she had put her, on the outside. The weapon was quiet. It was legal. It fit on a single sheet of official paper. In 1937, months after her husband became King George VI, he issued letters patent concerning his elder brother. The document granted Edward the style His Royal Highness, the Duke of Windsor. Then it did something colder and more exact. It denied the style Her Royal Highness to his wife, Wallis, and to any children the couple might one day have. The king handed his brother back a title. He refused the brother's wife the words that were meant to come with it. Those few words were the whole war in miniature. In the world Elizabeth defended, a style was not decoration. It was standing. It settled who ranked above whom and who owed deference to whom. A duchess without the royal style was a duchess the family need never treat as one of its own. Wallis would be received, on the rare occasions she was received at all, as a woman who had simply married up. For someone as proud as Wallis, that was a wound, and it was a wound by design, renewed each time a door failed to open and each time an invitation did not come. The king signed the document, but the resolve behind it is very widely credited to his wife. Elizabeth is thought to have stiffened him on this exact point, and it is not hard to see why it mattered so much to her. To understand the freeze, one has to understand what Wallis was to her. Wallis Simpson was the twice-divorced American for whom Edward VIII had given up his throne. To most of the country, she was a scandal. To Elizabeth, she was something heavier. She was the cause. In Elizabeth's account of it, this was the woman who had shaken the monarchy to its foundations, who had forced a shy and stammering second son onto a throne he had never wanted and never been prepared for, and who had, in doing so, laid a crushing load on a man of frail health. Elizabeth did not see a love story that had gone against the rules. She saw an act of wreckage aimed at her family, and she settled the blame on one person and never once moved it. That was the deepest truth of her character, shown here at full strength. She had a long memory, and she did not let a grievance die. Those who worked for her learned it. She could be all warmth in a room and turn, in an instant, to ice. She nursed slights for decades and forgave almost nothing. Most of the people who felt that coldness were servants and courtiers whose names never reached the public. Wallis was the grandest target of it and the most lasting. Consider the plain arithmetic of the grudge. The abdication came in December 1936. Elizabeth's husband became king on the 11th of December that year. They were crowned on the 12th of May, 1937, on the very date Edward had chosen for his own coronation, and the letters patent that shut Wallis out followed within weeks. George VI reigned 15 strained years and died on the 6th of February 1952, aged only 56. His widow lived on into old age. From the exile of 1937 to the Duke's funeral in 1972 ran 35 unbroken years of cold, and Elizabeth kept the door shut across every one of them. The Windsors spent those years abroad, most of them in France. They had money and glamour and a fashionable circle of their own. What they did not have was the one thing the Duke wanted most, which was to come home with his wife at her proper rank and be gathered back into the family he had been born into. That was refused. There was no post at court for him. There was no role. There was no warm word that might have said the quarrel was finished. The couple were held at the far edge of the family and left there, season after season, while the woman in the pastel coats smiled at the centre of it. The distance was not merely geography. A man could live in Paris and still belong to his family if the family wished it. This family did not wish it. The invitation home never came in the form the Duke longed for, and the silence was itself the message. Exile is usually pictured as a locked gate and a guard. Elizabeth's version was gentler to look at and just as final. It was a family that carried on without them, that mentioned them rarely, and that let the years do the rest. The Windsors could see the warmth of the House of Windsor from the outside, close enough to ache, and they were never once let back in. None of it was done with raised voices, and that was its signature. Elizabeth did not rail against Wallis in public. She used the heavier weapon of the closed door and the withheld courtesy. She simply declined, year upon year, to let the exile end. And in private, she gave the woman a name. She would not say Wallis. She would not say the Duchess of Windsor. She called her, flatly and always, that woman, and she called her that to the grave. The starkest moment of all came at the end, in 1972, when the Duke of Windsor died. His widow travelled briefly to England for the funeral. Here, if ever, was the moment for a truce. One old woman had lost a husband young to a crown she believed the Windsors had forced upon him. The other old woman was, that week, a widow herself. Grief might have reached out to grief. It did not. The contact was minimal, correct, and cold. The visit was got through, and no more. Then the Duchess returned to France, and the door closed quietly behind her once again. Two widows under one roof, and not a degree of thaw between them. So the feud forces a hard question. Was this loyalty, or was it cruelty wearing the clothes of loyalty? The case for loyalty is real and deserves to be put plainly. Elizabeth had watched a good and unready man handed a crown he dreaded. She had stood at his side through the stammer, through the war, through the strain that visibly aged him, and she had watched him die at 56 with the weight of it still on him. She believed, rightly or not, that the Windsors had done that to him. A woman who loves as fiercely as that does not pardon the people she holds responsible. From where she stood, keeping Wallis on the outside was an act of guardianship. She was defending the memory of the man the abdication had cost her, and the throne she thought Wallis had nearly toppled. But the other side of it does not go away. Wallis had committed no crime. She had married a man who was free in law to marry her. The punishment for that was a lifetime of exclusion, enforced by a family that held all the power, aimed at a woman who held almost none. The denial of a courtesy title looks small on paper and is enormous inside a life, felt fresh every single day for the rest of it. A grief that will not forgive starts, from the outside, to look a great deal like a cruelty that has taught itself to answer to the name of devotion. And Elizabeth did not soften with the years. She did not tire of it. She outlasted the Duke, and she had always meant to. What makes the Wallis story matter is that it did not stand alone. It was the template. Here, for the first time, the pattern showed itself whole. A woman marries into the House of Windsor. She is judged a danger to the family and the throne, and the smiling matriarch at the centre of it decides, quietly and for good, that this one will live her life on the outside. The blame is fixed, the door is shut, and the exile holds until death. Wallis Simpson was the first woman frozen out. She would not be the last. None of it ever looked like power. It looked like a courtesy withheld and a name refused across a dinner table. But a woman who could hold a door shut for 35 years without once raising her voice was not simply nursing an old grief. She was running something. The same cool hand that kept Wallis in permanent exile was closing, in these very years, over every private corner of the family. Behind the gentle gloved wave, the matriarch was taking the household firmly in hand. And the next life she reached for would not be an enemy's at all. It would be her own daughter's. Chapter 11. The matriarch behind the throne. Behind the twinkling public grandmother sat a woman who ran the family's private business with an iron and unforgiving hand. By 1953, she had a new address and a new role. Her daughter was queen. She herself was the widow now, the queen mother, moved out of Buckingham Palace and into Clarence House beside St. James's Palace. The world expected her to fade into quiet mourning. She did the opposite. She filled the rooms with her pictures and her porcelain and her Fabergé, and she settled in for nearly half a century of influence. The crown had passed to Elizabeth II. The family's private weather still came from her mother. She was no idle widow. She kept a household that an Edwardian grande dame would have recognized at a glance. Pages and footmen, dressers and chefs, chauffeurs, a treasurer, ladies-in-waiting, and an equerry. She entertained lavishly, and she kept a celebrated cellar. One story survives from the staff, of the Queen Mother calling down at midday that she did not know about anyone else, but she herself could do with a drink. It reads as warmth. It was also command. Everyone in those rooms moved to her rhythm. Everyone learned to read her moods. She dressed in the soft pastels and the feathered hats that were becoming her trademark, an entire visual brand kept up at real and steady expense. The gentle grandmother the country adored was, in private, a formidable operator, and she preferred it that way. The softness was the surface. The management ran underneath. The first real test of the widow years came from inside her own family. Her younger daughter, Princess Margaret, had fallen in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend. He was an equerry, a decorated airman, a man admired throughout the household. He was also divorced. In the Britain of the early 1950s, and in the eyes of the Church of England, that single fact was a wall. Margaret was in love, and the whole country knew it, and the papers followed every glance. Here the smiling mother showed her method. She did not rage. She did not forbid. She simply turned away from the problem and let the slow machinery of crown and church do the work she would not do with her own hands. The romance was left to wither in delay and disapproval. Time and pressure and silence ground it down. In 1955, Margaret gave Townsend up. Her statement spoke of duty to the church and to the Commonwealth. Her mother had lost nothing and conceded nothing. The institution came first. The woman inside it came second. It was the same cold instinct that had governed her long war on Wallis Simpson, turned now on her own child. Away from the family politics, she had a passion that was entirely her own, and this one was wholly genuine. She loved horses. National hunt racing, the jumping game, the mud and the cold mornings and the long odds took hold of her and never let go. It began in 1949 with an Irish-bred steeplechaser named Monaveen, bought in partnership with her elder daughter, then still Princess Elizabeth. Mother and daughter watched their horse run in the colours of blue and buff. Something in the older woman caught fire and stayed lit for the rest of her life. For the next 50 years, the horses ran under her name, and they won, and kept on winning. More than 450 races fell to her colours across half a century. Her 300th winner was a horse called Sunny Boy. Her 400th was Nearco Bay. She kept strings of horses in training, an expense no commercial owner could ever have justified, and she followed the form and the going with an expert's eye. The stable telephone was answered before breakfast. Trainers learned that she knew every horse, every leg, every entry. This was not a hobby held at arm's length. This was devotion, and everyone around her knew it. The racing was one of the few corners of her life where the warmth ran all the way down, unguarded and real. And then came the afternoon that racing people still talk about, the Grand National of 1956 at Aintree. Her horse was called Devon Lock, ridden by the jockey Dick Francis, later a celebrated writer of thrillers. Devon Lock ran the race of his life. Coming to the finish, he was 5 lengths clear, only 40 yards from the post, with the greatest steeplechase in the world already as good as won. And then, with nothing in front of him and nothing to jump, the horse suddenly leapt at the empty air, spread his legs, and sprawled flat onto the turf. The victory was gone in an instant. The crowd gasped as one. Her horse had thrown away a certain triumph in the very last strides. What she said afterward became part of her legend. No fury, no public tears. She looked at the ruin of the moment and said only, "Oh, that's racing." 2 small words, the composed face she had worn since her Glamis girlhood, laid over a loss that would have broken a lesser competitor. Behind the grace was the same iron discipline she used on everything else. She had learned as a young woman to feel deeply and show nothing, and she never once unlearned it. The cost of all of this was enormous, and it was largely met by other people. Her civil list annuity was fixed at £643,000 a year, set by the Civil List Order of 1990 and paid to her every year until her death. That sum was meant to cover her official duties, her households, and her staff. Her real spending ran far beyond it. She kept strings of racehorses, a large personal staff spread across several houses that celebrated Sella, and the pastel wardrobe that was her public brand. It was widely reported that she carried an overdraft of around £4 million at Coutts, the royal bank. That was the private truth the adoring crowds never saw. She spent as though money were not a thing that could ever run out, and the shortfall was quietly absorbed somewhere inside the wider royal finances and defended fiercely from any outside eye. The warmth the public bought into was underwritten by a gilded, old-fashioned, and very costly way of living. She never apologized for it. She never explained it. She simply carried on, gloved and smiling, as she had always done. The household knew a second woman behind the smiling one. Her pages and her dressers adored her, and they feared her, and the 2 feelings lived side by side in the same servants. She could turn to ice in a heartbeat. She never forgave a slight. She nursed her grudges for decades, keeping accounts in her memory that no bank could ever have held, and she ran a great deal of the family's private politics from behind the throne, with a velvet manner and an unbending will. Staff learned to read the temperature of a room the moment she entered it. A softness in the voice could carry a warning. A guest condemned in private might be met in public with the very same gentle grace as everyone else. The nation saw the smile. The family saw what was behind it. By the 1960s and 70s, she was, without question, the most powerful matriarch in the House of Windsor. Not powerful by office, for she held no throne and signed no laws. Her power was older and quieter than that. It ran on love that could not be questioned, on a public affection so complete that no one inside the palace dared move against her, and on a memory that forgot nothing at all. She had steered one daughter away from the man she loved. She had frozen out the woman she blamed for her husband's death. She sat at the center of the family like a still figure at the heart of a web, gentle to every eye, absolute in her reach. For many years the arrangement held, because there was only one sun in that sky, and it was her. The crowds came for her. The cameras always found her first. The powder blue and the little gloved wave belonged to her and to no one else. She had spent a whole lifetime building that place, brick by careful brick, and in 70 years, no one had ever taken a single inch of it from her. Then, at the close of the 1970s, a shy young woman with lowered eyes and a soft, hesitant voice stepped quietly into the family's story. The whole world was about to fall in love with her, and for the first time in half a century, the old queen in powder blue would stand at the edge of a crowd and watch every head turn towards someone else. Chapter 12. A new golden girl arrives. Then came a shy young woman the whole world fell in love with, and the old queen watched her own crowd turn their heads. Her name was Diana Spencer. She was young, well-born, and English, the daughter of an ancient family that had served the crown for generations. She had a way of lowering her head and looking up through her fringe that photographers could not stop shooting. She blushed on camera. She wore soft colours. To a country hungry for a fairy tale, she looked like the answer to a prayer. And within months of her name reaching the newspapers, the affection of an entire nation began to move. For half a century, that affection had belonged, above all others, to one woman. Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, had built it and guarded it and spent it like treasure. The pastel coats, the powder blue hats, the gentle gloved wave that promised the world was still gentle and still kind. She was past 80 now. She had never once known a rival for the public heart. Then, a girl barely out of her teens walked into the frame, and the cameras turned toward her. The old queen noticed. She had spent a lifetime reading crowds. She knew, better than anyone alive, the exact sound a street made when it fell in love. Now she heard that sound rising for someone else. She had earned her own share of it across 80 years and never once had to divide it. The affection had come to her slowly, and she had shaped it with the care of a craftswoman, coat by coat, wave by wave, until it felt to the country like something natural and eternal. It was hers, and a matriarch who guarded the throne itself against every threat was hardly the woman to hand a portion of the public heart to a newcomer without feeling the loss of it. The link between the two women was no accident, and this is where the story grows tangled. Diana's grandmother was Ruth, Lady Fermoy, and Ruth, Lady Fermoy, was the Queen Mother's closest friend. She had been born in 1908. For 33 years, she served the Queen Mother as woman of the bedchamber, one of the small circle of ladies who attended her in private, travelled at her side, and learned her moods. The two women were true intimates. They shared music and taste and a whole vanished world of manners. And Ruth, Lady Fermoy, was also grandmother to the girl the newspapers now called the future Princess of Wales. Two old friends. one young granddaughter, the heir to the throne in want of a bride. The pieces sat close enough together that people drew the obvious line straight through them. The popular story almost wrote itself. Two grand old women, it was said, had put their heads together and arranged the whole thing. The Queen Mother wanted her grandson, Charles, settled with a suitable English girl, well-bred, unmarried, without a past the press could dig up. Lady Fermoy had exactly such a girl inside her own family. Between them, so the tale ran, the match was steered quietly from the drawing rooms of the old aristocracy into the most watched wedding of the age. It was a tidy story. It fitted everything the public believed about how the palace really worked. It has been repeated so often that many now take it as plain fact. The truth is harder, and it deserves care. Lady Fermoy herself denied it. Asked whether she had helped to make the marriage, she said words to the effect that people could say so if they wished, but that it simply would not be true. And that was not the end of it. By the accounts of those close to the family, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, did far more than turn down the credit. She warned her own granddaughter against the marriage. She told Diana that the young man and the young woman had a different sense of humour and a different way of life, and that it would not suit her. The woman later cast as the architect of the fairy tale had, by this account, tried to talk the bride out of it. She knew Charles. She knew the household from the inside. She had spent 3 decades in its rooms, and she understood how heavily that life pressed on the people who lived it. She looked at her radiant granddaughter, and she did not see a triumph. She saw a mismatch, and she said so, plainly, to the one person it might have saved. Consider the position she was in. On one side stood the queen she had served with total loyalty for 33 years, a woman she loved, and a family she had spent her life inside. On the other stood her own granddaughter, young and dazzled, and about to marry the heir to the throne. Loyalty pulled one way, blood pulled another. The neat legend of 2 old women scheming a wedding into being leaves out the plainest fact in the record. One of those 2 women looked at the marriage everyone expected her to want and tried to warn it away before it began. What can be stated without hedging is this: the Queen Mother favoured the match. At the outset, she wanted it. Diana was everything the old queen valued in a royal bride. She was young and unspoiled, from good English blood, raised near the family, close enough to be known and trusted. A granddaughter of her dearest friend would carry no ugly surprises. The girl seemed pliable and gentle and grateful. To a matriarch who had spent 40 years defending the throne from the wrong sort of woman, Diana looked like exactly the right sort. For once, it seemed, the family had chosen well. And so the wedding went ahead in 1981. It was staged as a national fairy tale, and the nation took it to heart. Crowds slept on the pavements for a place along the route. Millions more watched from their homes. For one bright day, the monarchy looked less like an institution and more like a dream a whole country could share. At the centre of it stood the shy girl with the lowered eyes, transformed now into the Princess of Wales, the most photographed woman on earth. The Queen Mother had wanted this. She had helped to bless it. And yet something in the arithmetic of public love had shifted, and it would not shift back. Because the crowds did not simply admire the new princess. They adored her. They wanted her the way they had once wanted only the smiling grandmother in powder blue. Diana had something the old queen had spent a lifetime manufacturing, and she had it without seeming to try. She was young, where Elizabeth was ancient, modern, where Elizabeth was Edwardian, warm and unguarded in a way the cameras could not get enough of. Where the Queen Mother had built her image with the patience of an architect, Diana simply walked into a room, and the room was hers. The newspapers made the comparison inevitable. Every front page that carried the young princess carried her instead of the older woman, not beside her. The photographers who had once waited patiently for the smiling grandmother now ran for the girl in the doorway. Column inches are a kind of currency, and the whole of that currency was flowing one way. A woman who had built her long reign of affection on being seen understood precisely what it meant to be looked past. For a while, the two of them shared the light. The old queen was gracious. The young princess was dutiful. In public, they smiled, and the public saw two generations of the same warm family, arm in arm. But the Queen Mother had never in her long life shared the public heart, and she was not built to start now. She had watched Wallis Simpson threaten the throne, and she had never forgiven it. She had watched her own husband carried to an early grave by a crown he never wanted, and she blamed a woman for it still. Her whole life had taught her one lesson above all others. The family came first. The institution came first. Any woman who put a crack in either would one day learn how cold the smile could turn. For now, none of that showed. The marriage was young. The princess was beloved. The old queen waved her gloved wave, said the right things, and kept her own counsel. Yet the warning Ruth, Lady Fermoy, had pressed on her granddaughter did not vanish because the wedding was beautiful. The different senses of humour were still different. The different ways of life were still apart. Behind the palace gates, in the rooms the cameras never reached, the fairy tale had already begun to strain at its seams, and the Queen Mother was watching. She had favoured Diana while Diana was an asset. She would stay her friend only as long as the marriage held. Once it began to fail, the same instinct that had frozen out the woman of her youth would turn, quietly and completely, on the golden girl of her old age. History was about to repeat itself. The princess the whole world adored would learn, as one woman already had, exactly how cold the gentle smile could turn. Chapter 13. The Second Woman. Frozen Out. History was repeating itself, and once again the coldest presence in the room wore powder blue and a gentle smile. The old queen had done this once before. A generation earlier, she had watched a young woman walk into the House of Windsor, and she had decided that this woman was a danger to everything she guarded. Now, deep in her 9th decade, she watched it happen again. The names had changed. The face in the pastel coat had not. Neither had the instinct behind it. The young woman this time was Diana. She had arrived like sunlight in 1981, radiant and modern and 20 years old, and the whole world had lost its heart to her. For the first time in half a century, the Queen Mother saw her own crowd turn its head. The adoration she had spent a lifetime building, the affection banked in the war and drawn on ever since, now flowed toward a granddaughter-in-law 2 generations younger. The old woman noticed. She noticed everything. At the beginning, she had been for the match. That much is safe to say. Diana came from the right world. Her grandmother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, had served the Queen Mother as woman of the bedchamber for 33 years and was one of her closest friends. The two families had holidayed near one another in Norfolk for a lifetime. On paper, it was the perfect royal marriage, a bride of good blood who suited the throne. And the popular story has always been that the two old friends arranged it between them, steering Charles and Diana toward the altar. The truth is quieter and stranger. Lady Fermoy denied it. She said plainly that anyone who claimed she had made the marriage was simply wrong. More than that, she is reported to have warned her own granddaughter against it. She told Diana that Charles and his family lived by a different sense of humour and a different way of life, and that it would not suit her. The one person who knew both households best looked at the fairy tale and saw the ending. Diana married him anyway, on the 29th of July, 1981, and for a few short years the pageant held. Then it cracked, and the crack widened across the whole of the 1980s and into the 90s. The marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales came apart slowly and then in public. There were separate lives, separate courts, wounded pride on both sides. The tabloids that had crowned Diana now fed on her unhappiness. And as the union failed, the royal household divided along a hard line. On one side stood the princess, isolated and overwhelmed inside an institution that had never once bent to make room for her. On the other stood the family, closing quietly around its own. The Queen Mother chose Charles without hesitation. He was her grandson, her favourite, the child she had petted and protected. Her sympathy lay wholly with him, and it never wavered. She had loved the idea of Diana when Diana was an ornament to the crown. She turned firmly against her the moment Diana became a problem for it. The warmth switched off like a lamp. Those who watched the family up close describe an old woman who could sit across a table from her grandson's wife, smile the famous smile, and grant her nothing at all behind it. She did not shout. She never had. That was not how she worked. Her weapon was the closed door, the averted eye, the invitation not sent, the coolness that a whole court learns to copy. The most powerful matriarch in the royal family had made her judgment, and when the Queen Mother judged someone, the temperature of every room changed. Diana found herself frozen out inside the very palace that was meant to be her home, marked as the one who had wounded the boy the old queen loved, and the coldness of the grandmother deepened the loneliness that was already crushing her. Watch it from a distance, and the pattern is almost exact. Decades before, another young woman had come into this family and been declared its enemy. Wallis Simpson had taken a king and, as the Queen Mother saw it, forced a throne onto a husband it later killed. For that, she was punished with exclusion that lasted the rest of both their lives. In 1937, the family denied Wallis the style Her Royal Highness, and the Queen Mother was the emotional engine of that denial. Wallis lived out her years in exile in France, never brought back into the fold, never given real royal standing. To the grave, the old queen called her only that woman. Now the same cold current ran again. The details differed. The heart of it did not. Both women had been drawn into the House of Windsor by love and dazzle. Both had been judged a threat to the institution and the men inside it. Both had found the same soft, smiling, unforgiving presence set immovably against them. Wallis was the enemy of her youth and her widowhood. Diana was the enemy of her old age. A generation apart, two of the most talked about women of the century, and behind each of them stood the identical pastel figure, gloved hands folded, refusing to yield. Here the story asks for great care, because the framing can run ahead of the facts. The Queen Mother did not destroy Diana in any literal sense. There was no plot, no violence, nothing but the slow machinery of a family drawing its ranks tight. What is defensible, and what the record supports, is this. The most powerful woman in the royal family closed her heart against the most loved princess in the world, and her coldness was one of the forces that left Diana alone inside the palace when she most needed it not to be. Isolation, not annihilation. But to a young woman already drowning, isolation can feel like the same thing. This is the truest measure of the second woman she froze out. The nation saw the smile. The family saw what stood behind it. Millions watched the Queen Mother move through the 1990s as the beloved grandmother of Britain, waving her gentle wave, and they never once guessed that inside her own house she had shut a door on Diana and thrown the affection away. The powder blue was armor. It always had been. It let a hard verdict travel, dressed as kindness. Then came Paris. On the 31st of August, 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, died in a car crash in a road tunnel in the French capital. She was 36 years old. The most photographed woman on earth was gone in a moment, and the grief that followed swept across the world in a wave the palace had not seen coming and did not know how to answer. Flowers rose in mountains at the gates. A nation wept for the young woman the family had kept at arm's length. The gap between how the public had loved Diana and how the household had treated her stood exposed for everyone to see. And the Queen Mother lived on. That is the strange, quiet fact at the centre of this chapter. The old woman who had turned to ice against the young one outlasted her by nearly 5 years. The enemy of her old age was buried, mourned by the whole earth, and the pastel figure in the powder blue coat went on. She had done it before, too. She had outlived Wallis. She had outlived the Duke of Windsor. Now she had outlived Diana as well. Every woman she had frozen out went into the ground before her, and still she endured, smiling, waving, the last one standing. It is tempting to look for softening at the end, for some sign that the length of her life had taught her mercy. There is little of it here. She had watched a granddaughter-in-law suffer, and she had not thawed. She had watched the world grieve, and she had not bent. The steel that was forged at Glamis 100 years earlier held to the last. She had chosen her family over the woman inside it, exactly as she had chosen it over Wallis, exactly as she had chosen it over her own daughter Margaret and the man Margaret loved. The institution first, always, whatever it cost the women who married into it. 2 enemies chosen across a single long life. 2 women drawn into the family she guarded. 2 exiles from the warmth she was famous for. And now, in the last years left to her, the woman who had outlived them all turned toward her own ending. She was past 90 and spending like an empress. The century she had personally spanned, from the reign of Victoria to her own great-grandchildren, was almost run. The beloved image was still perfectly intact, but the bills were coming due, and the vanished world she embodied was very nearly the only thing left of her. Chapter 14. The Last of a Vanished World. She was a Victorian to the end, spending like an empress in a country that had long since stopped being one. She had been born in the reign of Queen Victoria. Consider what that meant. When she came into the world, on the 4th of August 1900, the old queen still held the throne, and a quarter of the globe was ruled from London. By the close of her own life, she was surrounded by her great-grandchildren, a new generation growing up in a smaller and plainer Britain. She had lived through the whole of the 20th century. She was the single human thread that ran from the age of Victoria to the age of the tabloid, and she never once let go of the world she had been born into. Everything about her old age was a performance of that vanished world. She held court at Clarence House, her London home since 1953, among her pictures and her porcelain and her Fabergé. She kept a country retreat at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. Each year she travelled to the far north of Scotland, to the Castle of May, the derelict tower she had rescued from ruin half a century before. She went every August and every October, as she had done since 1955. The rhythm never changed. She lived by a calendar the modern age no longer recognised, and she saw no reason to explain herself. The household that carried her through each day belonged to another century entirely. She employed pages and footmen, dressers and chefs and chauffeurs. She kept a treasurer, ladies in waiting, and an equerry. She entertained lavishly. She kept a celebrated cellar, and she loved it without shame. One favourite story of the household has her calling down at midday that she did not know about anyone else, but she herself could do with a drink. She dressed in soft pastels and feathered hats, a whole manufactured look maintained at real expense, and she wore it like armor into her 10th decade. The pages who dressed her adored her. They also feared her. Both feelings were correct. None of it came cheap. In 1990, her civil list annuity was fixed at £643,000 a year, a sum voted by Parliament to cover her official duties, her households, and her staff. It was a large figure by any measure. It was also nowhere near enough. Her personal spending ran far beyond anything an annuity could hold, and the difference had to be found somewhere. She never troubled herself with where. That was a servant's problem, or a banker's, and she had both. This is where the celebrated part begins. It was widely reported in the press during her life and again after her death that she carried a very large overdraft at Coutts, the royal bank, with figures of around £4 million cited. It was never a formally published account. It was an allegation, repeated so often that it became part of the legend. And the legend suited her. It said, without apology, that she spent as though money were a thing that happened to other people. The shortfall was quietly understood to be met from within the wider royal finances. No one who worked for her expected her to change. No one dared to suggest it. She had lived through 2 world wars and the loss of an empire, and she was not about to start counting shillings now. Her most costly passion of all was national hunt racing. She had begun in 1949 with an Irish-bred steeplechaser called Monaveen, owned in partnership with her elder daughter. Over the following half-century, her horses won more than 450 races under her colours of blue and buff. Her 300th winner was a horse called Sunny Boy. Her 400th was Nearco Bay. She kept strings of horses in training, an expense that no commercial owner could ever have justified. And she followed the sport with the eye of an expert until the very end. It was genuine joy. It was also money, poured out year after year into something that gave her nothing back but pleasure. In this, at least, the warmth was not a performance. Set the numbers side by side, and the scale of it comes clear. She was born in 1900 and lived to be 101 years old, the longest-lived member of the royal family in its history. Her civil list annuity, fixed in 1990, was £643,000 a year. Her reported overdraft at Coutts was said to run to some £4 million. Her horses had won more than 450 races. She had rescued one derelict castle in Caithness and filled another house in London with Fabergé. And when it was all finally counted, the estate she would leave was valued at around £70 million. One woman, 1 century, a fortune in art and jewels. That estate is the true measure of the life. Around £70 million. And most of it was not land or shares, but art, jewels, and personal possessions, gathered across 100 years of gilded living. It would pass, on her death, to her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II. She had never held a great landed fortune of her own, the kind a Victorian magnate would have recognised. What she had instead was a way of living, sustained by the state and by the crown, and defended from scrutiny with an iron the smiling public never saw. She spent like an empress, because in her own mind, that was simply what a queen did. And here is the strangest thing about these last years. Everything behind the image had frayed, and still the image held. Her husband was 50 years dead. Her long war on Wallis had hardened into a single private word she carried to old age. Her coldness toward Diana had shown, to anyone who cared to look, the steel the public was never sold. 2 of her own nieces had been shut away and written down as dead while they still breathed. And in 1987, the truth of it had reached the newspapers. The family's talent for burying its own had been laid open. Yet the powder blue coats and the gentle gloved wave did their work all the same. The nation saw the smile. What was behind it stayed behind it. She had built that image herself, deliberately, over decades, and it turned out to be the most durable thing she ever made. It outlasted the empire she was born into. It outlasted the deference that had once propped the whole aristocracy up. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the younger royals were torn apart in the press, their marriages and their secrets picked over week by week. She was not. The affection earned in the war, and the manner she never once dropped, held firm against every private truth that might have undone a lesser reputation. She had become the last of a certain kind of royal woman. She knew it, and she gave the country no reason on earth to let her go. Why did the warmth survive when so much behind it did not? Partly because she had made it so well that it no longer needed defending. Partly because the people who might have questioned it loved her too much to try. But partly, too, because she had spent a century learning the family trade she was born into, the quiet art of keeping the door shut and the smile fixed. The girl raised at Glamis had grown into the finest keeper of appearances the monarchy ever produced. The grandeur was real. The grievances were real. She held both in the same gloved hand, and she let the public see only one. She kept moving for as long as her body allowed. In July 1996, she made the Castle of May over to a trust, so that the one place she had truly rescued would outlive her. She went on visiting it, north to that cold Caithness coast, every August and every October, until the very last of her strength was gone. Her final stay there came in October 2001. She was 101 years old. She had watched 100 years pass, and she was still travelling to the top of Scotland to stand and look at the sea. But the machinery of even the longest life was finally slowing. The visits north were nearly done. Soon the horses would run without her. She had outlasted almost everyone she had ever known, every rival and every friend, and now the last spring of that impossibly long life was coming on. It would ask more of her than any winter ever had. Before it was over, the family would gather at Windsor not once, but twice, and the first coffin carried in would not be hers. Chapter 15. A Spring of Two Funerals. In the last spring of her long life, she buried her youngest daughter, and 7 weeks later, the nation buried her. Princess Margaret went first. She died on the 9th of February 2002, after years of failing health. For the Queen Mother, it was the cruelest loss of all. She had outlived a husband, a brother, and almost the whole world she had been born into. Now she outlived a child. There is no grief older or harder than that, and it came to her at the very end, when she had the least strength left to carry it. She had learned to carry grief a long time before. As a girl at Glamis, she had lost her brother Fergus in the war, and she had learned then to fold the pain away and keep the face calm. She had done it again in 1952, when George VI died at 56 and left her a widow at the height of her power. Grief was old ground to her. She had built a public life on the trick of never showing it. But a daughter was different. Margaret was the younger of her two girls, the spirited one, the one whose own heart had been steered and disappointed decades before. Watching her go was the last blow of a very long life. The Queen Mother was 101 years old by then. She was frail now and slow, but the will had not gone out of her. She had made her final visit to her beloved Castle of May only months earlier, in October 2001. She still kept her horses. She still dressed in the soft pastels the country knew her by. And even in mourning, she held herself upright by long habit, composed in front of the cameras, giving the public the calm face it had always been shown. It was the same discipline she had practiced for 100 years, and she practiced it now over the coffin of her own child. She did not have long to follow. On the 30th of March 2002, at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, the Queen Mother died peacefully. The 7 weeks between the two deaths were the last of her life, and she spent them as the mother of a daughter she had just buried. She was 101 years and 238 days old, the longest-lived member of the British royal family in its whole history. She had been born in the reign of Queen Victoria. She died in the reign of her own daughter. A single life had reached clean across the modern history of the crown, from the age of empire to the age of the tabloid, and now it was over. What followed showed exactly how well the image had held. For 70 years the public had loved the smiling grandmother in powder blue, and the country now gave her the farewell of a queen. Her body was brought to London. Her coffin was carried to lie in state in Westminster Hall, the ancient stone chamber where the nation mourns its kings and queens. The lying in state began on the 5th of April. Then came the people. They arrived in numbers few had predicted. Over 3 days, an estimated 200,000 mourners filed slowly past the coffin, in a queue that stretched back along the Thames and grew so long that the opening hours had to be extended to let everyone in. They shuffled through the great hall in silence, past the still guardsmen and the flickering light, past the crown that rested on the lid. Some were old enough to remember the Blitz and the walks through the wreckage. Many were far too young to remember anything she had actually done. They came all the same, for the face and the feeling, for what she had seemed to be. It was a remarkable proof of how completely the beloved image had held. There had been years of quiet grumbling in the press about the cost of her, about the horses and the households and the reported overdraft at the bank. None of it touched the crowd in Westminster Hall. They did not queue for the finances or the feuds. They queued for the smiling grandmother of the nation, the one fixed point of warmth that had seemed to stand outside every argument the country had with its monarchy. She had spent a century building that feeling, and here at the very end it delivered its final and largest return. The numbers of that spring tell the size of it. Princess Margaret died on the 9th of February. The Queen Mother died on the 30th of March 2002, aged 101 at Royal Lodge. Her lying in state opened on the 5th of April, and across 3 days, an estimated 200,000 people filed past her coffin. Her funeral came on the 9th of April, watched by around 10 million viewers in the United Kingdom, and it was reported to have cost about £5,400,000. 50 years earlier, almost to the week, she had buried the husband whose death she never forgave. The funeral was held at Westminster Abbey on the 9th of April 2002. It was the same church where she had married her shy, stammering prince in 1923, and where the two of them had been crowned together in 1937, on the date first set for another man's coronation. The Abbey had bracketed her whole royal life. It was where she had begun as a duchess who never expected a throne, and it was where the country now said goodbye. Around 10 million people watched in Britain. They saw the coffin carried through the streets, the massed soldiers, the slow bells, the royal family walking behind. They saw a monarchy staging the thing it does best, the grand and solemn farewell, the ritual that turns a private death into a shared national event. The whole occasion was reported to have cost some £5,400,000, a fitting last figure for a woman whose warmth had always been maintained at great expense and defended from scrutiny. The gilded way of life she had lived was given a gilded end. Then she was taken to Windsor. She was buried in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor Castle, laid to rest beside the husband she had lost half a century before. It was the reunion she had waited 50 years for. The man she believed had been forced onto a throne that killed him. The man whose early death she had blamed on others to the end of her days was there beside her once more. And on that same day, in that same small chapel, the ashes of Princess Margaret were laid to rest too. Mother, father, and youngest daughter gathered together in the end in a quiet stone room within the walls of Windsor. The spring that had opened with one royal funeral closed with another. The two women who had walked at the centre of the family and suffered inside it were brought into the same ground within weeks of each other. The long story of the House of Windsor's most powerful matriarch ended there, sealed behind a slab in a chapel most of the crowds would never see. Outside, the country grieved. Inside, a family that had feared her for decades took in the fact that she was finally gone. The powder blue coats went into the past. The gentle gloved wave was stilled. 200,000 people had queued through the night to honour her, and around 10 million had watched her go, and the affection was real, and it was enormous, and it reached back across a whole century of British life. And yet the crowds and the cameras had honoured an image more than a woman. That was the strange truth of her ending. The face had held to the very last, warm and smiling and adored, exactly as she had built it to be. But it had only ever been half of her. The other half, the long memory, the iron will, the two enemies frozen out, and the secrets buried at Glamis and in the family record, had been laid in the ground with her, unspoken, under a mountain of flowers. So her death left one question unanswered, the one this whole story has been circling from the start. Who was she, really, behind the powder blue? The most loved woman in Britain, or the most feared operator in her own house? Now that the coffin was closed and the ground was sealed, the time had come to weigh the two against each other, and to reckon at last with what 101 years had truly been. Chapter 16. The Steel Behind the Smile. They came in their hundreds of thousands to mourn a smile, and almost none of them knew the woman it had belonged to. For 3 days in April 2002, the queue moved through Westminster Hall in a slow and steady river. An estimated 200,000 people filed past her coffin. The lines stretched so far that the opening hours had to be extended into the night. On the 9th of April, around 10 million viewers in the United Kingdom watched her funeral. They had come to grieve the grandmother of a nation. They had come to grieve the powder blue. That was the image. The soft pastel coats, the feathered hats, the little gloved wave that seemed to promise everyone watching that the world was still gentle and still kind. For 70 years, it had been the most loved face in Britain. And on the day it was carried into the King George VI Memorial Chapel, laid beside the husband she had buried half a century before, the nation wept for the very thing it had been sold. This is where the film must weigh one woman against the other. Not two different people, but two truths about the same person. The face the public adored was real. Millions loved it, and that love did real work. It carried an ancient and privileged institution safely through a century that swept most of Europe's monarchies away. But behind the pastel armour stood a woman of long memory and colder instinct, and the people who worked for her knew it. Her pages and her dressers adored her and feared her in equal measure. She could turn to ice. She never forgave a slight. She nursed grievances for decades and let none of them die. The clearest proof of that hardness lies in two women, a generation apart. Both were drawn into the House of Windsor. Both ended on the outside, and behind both of them stood the same gentle smile. The first, was Wallis Simpson. To the Queen Mother, she was the woman who had destabilized the monarchy, forced a stammering and frail man onto a throne he never wanted, and, as she saw it, shortened his life through the strain of a job that killed him at 56. In 1937, the letters patent granted the abdicated Edward the style His Royal Highness the Duke of Windsor, and pointedly denied the style Her Royal Highness to his wife. The Queen Mother is very widely credited with hardening her husband's resolve on that point. It became the permanent public mark of Wallis's exclusion. The couple lived out their years in exile, largely in France, frozen out of the family and never brought back into the fold. When the Duke died in 1972, and the widow came briefly to England for his funeral, the contact was minimal and cold. To the end, in the Queen Mother's private vocabulary, Wallis was only ever that woman. The second was Diana, 2 generations younger, radiant, modern, and adored by the public on a scale that came to rival the Queen Mother's own. Here the film must tread with care. She did not destroy Diana in any literal sense. What is defensible is that the most powerful matriarch in the family closed ranks against her. As the Wales marriage disintegrated across the 1980s and 1990s, the Queen Mother's sympathies lay wholly with her grandson, Charles, and she stood immovably behind him. Many biographers place her among the senior royals, whose coldness deepened Diana's isolation inside an institution that already overwhelmed her. Diana died in a car crash in Paris on the 31st of August, 1997. The old queen outlived her by nearly 5 years. The enemy of her youth and the enemy of her old age were the same emotion seen twice. The pattern did not begin with either of them. It began at home, inside a family practiced at burying its own. For generations, the Strathmores were said to guard a terrible secret at Glamis Castle, a deformed heir hidden away in a walled-up room, kept alive while the world was told he had died in infancy. That is legend, not documented fact, and it must be told as legend. One much-quoted verdict held that the real secret of Glamis is that there is no secret. But true or not, the story reveals the culture that raised her. This was a family that knew how to lock inconvenient truths behind stone and smile at the door. And there was a truth far more damning than any ghost story, because this one is documented. 2 of the Queen Mother's own nieces, Nerissa Bowes-Lyon, born in 1919, and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, born in 1926, were the daughters of her brother John Herbert. Both were born with severe learning disabilities. In 1941, they were placed in the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Redhill, Surrey, and there they vanished from the family record. The 1963 edition of Burke's Peerage, the standard reference of the British aristocracy, recorded both sisters as dead. Neither was. Nerissa lived until 1986, Catherine until 2014. The family's recorded contribution to their care was £125 a year. The truth that they were alive was only exposed in 1987 by the Sun. While the family's most famous daughter reigned as the warm and smiling face of the monarchy, 2 of her own blood had been shut away and written down as dead. The warmth itself was a construction, and it was maintained at great expense. Her civil list annuity was fixed at £643,000 a year by the order of 1990. Her personal spending ran famously far beyond it. She kept pages, footmen, dressers, chefs, chauffeurs, a treasurer, and ladies-in-waiting, an establishment an Edwardian grande dame would have recognised. She dressed in the soft pastels and feathered hats that were, in the end, an entire manufactured visual brand. Her costliest passion was national hunt racing, and across half a century, her horses won more than 450 races under her colours of blue and buff. It was widely reported that she ran an overdraft at Coutts of around £4 million, a press allegation rather than a published account, and the shortfall was understood to be met from within the wider royal finances. On her death, her estate was reported to be worth in the region of £70 million. Her funeral was said to have cost some £5,400,000. The gentle grandmother in powder blue was one of the most expensive images the modern crown ever produced. Two reputations survive her, and the gap between them is the reckoning. One is the official version, the indomitable, twinkling wartime queen and grandmother of a nation, sustained by a long line of admiring biographies and by the affection of the generation that remembered the Blitz. The other is the revisionist one, advanced by later writers, of a formidable, extravagant, and unforgiving woman who ran the family's private politics and let no grievance die. Both are true. She was born in the reign of Queen Victoria and died in the reign of her own daughter, the single human thread from the age of empire to the age of the tabloid. And she carried the family's oldest instinct, control and concealment, into the very heart of the modern crown. So return, at the last, to that image, the pastel coat, the gloved wave, the smile that made an old and guarded institution feel like family. It was not a lie, exactly. It was a performance so complete that its author never once let it slip. She had learned as a girl at Glamis to put a composed and cheerful face over private strain, and she wore that face for 101 years, over grief, over grudge, over everything the household saw and the nation never did. That is the whole of her, held in a single frame. The nation saw the smile. The family saw what was behind it. She smiled at people she had privately condemned and never forgiven. She could stand at a funeral and mean none of it. And to the end of her long life, the woman she blamed for the death of her husband remained, in the only name she would give her, that woman. Which leaves the question the film has been circling for 101 years. What does it mean that the most loved figure in a country was also the most feared operator in her own house? She built the warmest, most human face the modern monarchy ever sold, and behind it she froze out two of the century's most talked about women, and let her own erased nieces stay erased. If an institution can only earn a nation's love by manufacturing a face this soft over a will this hard, then the deepest lesson of her life is a troubling one. Power does not always look like a fortress. Sometimes it looks like a smile. And a nation, filing past a coffin in its hundreds of thousands, will pay almost any price for the comfort of being told the world is still gentle and still kind. If this story held you to the end, subscribe, because I have many more like it on the way. And tell me below, do you think a person can be the most loved figure in a nation and the most feared woman in her own family at the same time? And which of the two do you believe was the real Queen Mother? I read every reply.